To whom it may concern, I have created this short presentation to address the issues I have with the current skill leveling system in place with Skyrim. In this short presentation, I will deconstruct the current system, pointing out the good and recognizing areas that could be improved. I will then go on to talk about a relevant UI from another game. This user interface holds similarities to our own, but seems to lack the issues that I find within Skyrim's current system. From this, I will discuss my dive into redesigning Skyrim's skill UI system, addressing the issues I have with it, culminating in a demonstration of the new system using Figma. Following the demonstration, I will go on to evaluate my prototype against the current system and feedback collected from testers. I appreciate you taking your time to hear this, so let's begin. Before I break down the current system and talk about the bad, I would like to address what I like about the current system and what stands out to me. The system really nails the theme of Skyrim, providing a very immersive user experience, fitting right into the adventurous magical nature of the game. This is carried across into practice with how you actually navigate the system. Navigation within the system is itself a smaller journey you take separately away from the car adventuring. And then there's the open-ended nature of the design that does not put emphasis on RPG roles and skill types, with this in particular being fairly interesting to me. By this I mean when the standard RPG roles are de-emphasized, it encourages players to build their own role type, encouraging experimentation and merging skills to find something new that suits them and what they want to do. That said, I do believe the system has issues. Navigation is not easy, although it is very visually pleasing, and like I said, it can provide in itself a micro-adventure. This does not translate very well for repeat use. It eventually becomes a task to navigate through the many screens, seeing as you will be spending lots of time in here, and this can only lead to frustration. When wanting to interact with a specific skill type, the current system only allows for the user to interact with the skill at the center of the screen. To interact with others, you have to pull them to the center. However, you can't click on the ones at the far side of the screen and have them come to the center. You must manually scroll through the adjacent skills until you reach your destination, which becomes very tedious very quickly. Not to mention the severe motion blur that occurs as you slide. I personally don't suffer from any form of motion sickness or anything like that, but even for me it made me feel slightly dizzy, so I can actively see this affecting the accessibility of this system to those more susceptible to this sort of thing. Then there's the issue, also, of navigating through the skill tree section. Using a mouse to click to the specific skill you want is no issue, but the problem comes in when you use keys or a controller joystick, as it proves to be very difficult, sometimes sending you far past the intended skill you wanted. Forget easily navigating to the skills that are set at an angle as well, because that just turns into a frustrating process of trial and error until you suddenly land on the skill you wanted. There's also the issue that all the skills in this tree are cut off by this screen, which is kind of a double-edged sword. I understand that they want to visually make it clear through composition that the skills you see in the start of the tree are the ones that you as a player will get through first, and the ones further away are for later in the game, which is a cool idea in theory, but in practice becomes, again, a very tedious thing to have to travel through all the skills upon repeat visits, which will become a very annoying thing. Overall, there are so many things that affect ease of use, accessibility of the system, user predictability, and more that ultimately end up hurting the user experience. Now, I found similarities in Assassin's Creed Valhalla's system to our current system. It is an RPG skill-based leveling system that incorporates star signs and progression through a connection of lines to reach higher up skills. It is a similar system but is able to achieve a better outcome. Firstly, it splits the three skill types into sections using similarity in colour to create clear distinctions between the skill types, something Skyrim's current system attempts but does not quite reach the clarity that Valhalla's does. And yes, in a previous slide I did praise the system for doing the complete opposite. However, I do feel incorporating a similar system into our own would benefit all players, and this is something I found to be true when I sent out my current prototype for testing, which is something I will discuss later within my evaluation. Secondly, it builds upon the distinctions by using star signs and lines, utilizing the proximity idea established from Gestalt theory, which is not too dissimilar to our own system, but the reason it is more effective here is because of the first point I made, the better navigation. I found that the way proximity is used here in tandem with the better navigation to be more effective at getting me to explore and experiment with what is presented, which addresses the point I made about the encouragement to experiment by de-emphasizing RPG roles that I liked about our current system. It shows that we can still obtain this effect even if we apply some level of categorization. With this in mind, and the fact that this system is also very thematically similar to ours, it was destined that I use Valhalla as a useful resource to learn from to help improve our own. From this, I set out and sketched out 3 ideas. The premise of my designs was to make a UI that kept in the theme of our current system, but improved upon the navigational aspects. I also felt providing some form of distinction between skill types would help players navigate the system, which did mean I had to do some drastic overhauls to the current design. I also had to keep in mind that each skill type had 6 core skills, with each skill having further individual skills to be unlocked inside of that skill. These were my initial ideas, and are all focused around ease of navigation and providing clear distinctions between each skill type. Here are the flow diagrams for each of these ideas. Although none of these ideas were taken forward any further, they helped me realize my final idea. After all of that, this was the idea that I took forward. It was a mash of all the ideas, really. I realized that each of these ideas had their strengths, but picturing them in practice, especially with the abundance of information needed for an RPG skill system, proved problematic. So I created this design, which is the one you will see fully imagined in the prototype after this slide. I continued the circle motif again as it was effective, but this time I pulled each skill type into one section of a circle. I also brought the idea of screen lighting up with the associated colour, which added a nice visual flair with great player feedback. Clicking any section would take them to an associated skill hub screen where they could select a skill area. This would take the player to a screen where they could then select individual skills. I wanted every screen to be easily accessed from any point, so I kept the circle at the bottom corner of the screen, which was supposed to act as an anchor of information and navigation. This was changed ever so slightly in the final prototype, as you will see. A main one to point out right now is the decision to have the circle maintain its position in the right corner for the sake of consistency and accessibility. Here is what a flow of this idea will look like. Welcome to my demonstration of the redesigned UI system. As you can see here, each skill type is clearly categorized. As I hover over them, it shows some visual information related to that skill. Let's go down the warrior path. As we can see here, we have the 6 core skills of that selected skill type, with all the relevant information inside. As we hover over the skill icon, we get some nice visual feedback from the button. We also hover over this icon to get some information about the skill. And we can press these buttons to go to the next adjacent skill type. Now we are in the skill select screen. Here we can choose the skill of our choice to spend our points on. But I also want to see what other skills Warrior has to offer, so let's select one of the other skills. These buttons allow us to navigate to either one of the 6 core skills of the Warrior skill type. Let's check out this one. This skill in particular here seems interesting, so let's find some information about it. As you can see here, we have a pop-up telling us some information about this skill. So let's try and acquire it. As we hover over it, we can see that it is locked, because the required level for this is not the one that we meet. This skill appears that we can. If this were the actual game, I'd be able to select it and improve our character. Although everything was composed and functionality was added within Figma, a big part of the work took place in other software. Illustrator was used to create all the illustration-based graphics seen in the demo. It was a smooth process, and iterating between design ideas was easy. The actual screens and backgrounds were composed within Photoshop, which were then brought into Figma. I must mention that I had to redo the nebula background to fit more effectively within the new design. Eventually everything came together with the demonstration you just saw. The actual Figma document looks like this. As you can see, it is already fairly complex without even delving into the functionality. With functionality lines added, it looks like that. I managed to keep it highly organized, although looking back I do see things that I could have done differently, which have made it more efficient. Let's look back on the issues I talked about earlier with the current system. There was a lack of categorization that would assist the system, navigation was hugely mishandled, and there were accessibility issues. These were the fundamental issues that I point out with the current system. Now let's take a look at my responses to the issues. The entire system had to be redesigned to accommodate for the introduction of categorization. The redesign allowed me to address the navigational issues. With the introduction of the corner wheel is a huge positive for navigation, allowing for traversal between most screens with extreme ease. No more slow and repetitive scrolling through one skill at a time. And due to the redesign, the accessibility issues from before vanished. With that said, the issue of accessibility should have been handled better on my side. I recognize the issues from before no longer persist, but the new design has brought its own. Although none of my playtesters had issues with selecting the smaller icons, I realize now that none of them suffer from any disabilities that restrict them from performing specific mouse positioning, which you could argue is required for certain buttons. I should have had better foresight of this, but not to worry, as it is not too much of an issue, as it could be addressed simply with the slight positioning changes and size changes. That said, it should have been more present on my mind from the beginning. As I expressed before, I had sent out a prototype to a few people for testing, and I got all-around positive feedback from everyone I sent it to. I asked the testers to rate the experience out of 10 using these categories. Here are the mean numbers for what I received. I also asked them to give some statements so I could better understand their reasoning for the ratings. Both new and experienced players of Skyrim found that the system functions smoother than the current. As alluded to before, the newer player expressed that they liked the addition of clear skill types as it helped them get a better sense of direction in the game. And although everything was positive, there were some constructive points about the system. It seems that everyone at first was unable to properly recognize the back button, but they did mention that after they did, they felt that it was clear and they were just being oblivious. That said, we could take more steps to make the button clearer, perhaps a different color or background for the button. People also found it a little confusing with how the info box worked in the hub screens and skill area screens, as they both function differently. Steps could be taken to make them more consistent, perhaps making all of them clicks rather than the earlier ones being a hover. But aside from these small things, the reception to the new design is very strong, and I hope you take what I presented here and we can move forward with this new design. Thank you for listening.